Hi all, we're going to have a look now at Kasparov's round 3 in the Linares 1990 tournament. He was playing Lajos Portisch, who was around 2605 FIDE. Kasparov was 2800, so he had a significant rating advantage over his opponent. Knight f3 was played by Portisch. Kasparov went into his King's Indian, or inviting a King's Indian at least, because White then played e4. Kasparov played bishop g7, so potentially we've got a perk defence if White wanted to play it as an e4 opening, because after d4 Kasparov played d6, so White could have just played perhaps knight c3 or bishop e3 just to play it as though it was a perk, but actually Portisch played c4 now, so we have a King's Indian defence, and after knight f6, knight c3, Black castles, and White plays bishop e2, so this is all mainline King's Indian theory. e5. There's a reason, by the way, that White can't win the pawn. It involves a knight takes e4. In case you're not aware of that tactic, let's have a quick look. So say White tries to just win this pawn, knight takes e4. Many King's Indian players should know this. So it's this discovered attack on this knight, and if knight takes f7, that loses a whole piece because a bishop takes c3 check, and then king takes f7. Anyway, so this is mainline King's Indian theory. So Black plays knight c6. Now bishop e3, the more common move is d5. So with bishop e3, it's provoking this knight g4. And now White plays bishop g5. So White's idea is to provoke weaknesses in the Black camp. Kasparov plays f6, and White now retreats the bishop all the way back to c1. And now Kasparov played f5. So this is quite an interesting variation. The bishop now goes back to g5. So what has White achieved by this apparent loss of time? Well, it has committed Black to this f5 plan quite early on. That's one thing. And the centre is still not resolved here. So White might be playing d takes e5 instead of d5. So this could be quite dangerous for Black. Kasparov now chooses bishop f6. So the King's Indian player is usually very loyal to their bishop, so it's not an easy thing to give up this King's Indian bishop. But Kasparov does that because Black has some advantages elsewhere in the position, which I'll try and show, especially after White's next move, d takes e5. I don't think this is a critical move here. Looking in the chessworld.net master collection, this move, d takes e5, fares quite badly actually, Black seemingly winning most of the games. E takes f5 though is a more dangerous move statistically, and a lot of very high rated players have played it. In fact, there was a game Kasparov was with the white pieces against Anand in 1996, and Kasparov chose e takes f5 but actually lost that game against Anand. Nevertheless, e takes f5 has secured victories against people like John Nunn in other games. So I think e takes f5 is the most critical move here. D takes e5, d takes e5, and Black's always got a trump in this kind of position. This d4 square is often easier for Black to try and get a knight there than White getting a knight here, because the knight can always be kicked with c6 later if Black's knight went from c6. So I think White might be positionally on the brink of getting a slight disadvantage if it's played inaccurately here. Portisch exchanges queens and now plays knight d5. So he doesn't mind letting his e-pawn go. He doesn't want that responsibility of trying to protect it. So Kasparov took it, and so he exchanged it for the c7 pawn. And now the rook's attacked. There's only one move worth considering here, rook b8. And now rook d1. So White's got an unpleasant kind of pressure, because this bishop is a bit awkward, it seems. It can only go to d7. Nevertheless, to untangle the pieces here, Kasparov plays the only move, bishop d7. And notice here that it's as if white, it is quite comfortable, but on the other hand, if this knight moves, then black will have e4, and we're going to see that now. After bishop d3, black first played rook bc8, and white wanted to keep this knight in a seemingly strong square, so played knight d5. But Rybka here already thinks black's got a slight advantage from this position. And the reason is, after knight c5, black is threatening e4. And look at that d4 square. So, white did have a purpose though in winning that c7 pawn, because now there's no c6 for black to evict that knight from d5. So this seemingly materialistic idea of winning the c7 had a positional basis for it, to establish this strong knight on d5. But anyway, after bishop f1, Kasparov played bishop e6, and there are some issues in the white position here to consider. Namely, just taking on d5 followed by knight b4. If the knight goes back, black has some annoying pressure on this c4 pawn. So black is still slightly better here. White now played a very controversial seeming pawn sacrifice with b4. So Kasparov just accepted the pawn sacrifice. He took on d5 and just snapped that pawn. So what compensation does white have? Well, white takes that pawn. Now the pawn sacrifice is actually black could have taken here, but it's immune in this position because of this bishop c4 pin. So Kasparov first plays knight e4, so he's rounding up this d5 pawn. So he's not accepting that venom yet. He wants to improve his pieces first and then pick it up. So black's still slightly better according to Rybka. Bishop c4 was now played, and now Kasparov further attacks the pawn and faults actually d5 and d1 with this knight c3 move. So white actually now definitely gives up the pawn. Perhaps he could have tried d6 check. Rybka gives this as an interesting alternative. Now here, if king g7, perhaps white would have been able to be nearly okay with knight f7. There's an amazing idea here. If rook f8, d7, rook takes c4, and now not d8 queen, but actually knight d6, believe it or not. And the threat here is knight e8 check followed by d8 queening, so attacking that rook as well, and threatening knight e8 check. And this may have equalised in this variation, e.g. knight takes b7 here, takes the rook, and this is kind of a dynamic equality. That was worth considering anyway. White in the game just simply gave up that d pawn, and there wasn't really much compensation here for Portisch. He actually lost very, very rapidly from this position. He played g3, and after king g7, black's also got now nasty threats of king f6, just getting the king more aggressive and pressurising white even further. White now horrifically blundered with king g2. Can you see Kasparov's winning move here, which is the final move of the game? I'll give you 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He played simply knight e3 check, unleashing a discovered attack against his rook on d2. So this is just clearly winning the exchange. White resigned after this knight e3 check. So that seemed to be quite a strange game where white just drifted into a slight disadvantage out of the opening to losing the d pawn and then to losing the game with a horrible tactic.